Hello everybody and welcome to VFR. Today we are taking a look at why you should fly what I think is kind of a classic airplane for Microsoft Flight Simulator, the Aerosoft CRJ-700 and 550 in Microsoft Flight Simulator. So this is a really fun plane. It's a regional jet and it's one of the first big pay-aware airliners to come out for the sim. And I think it's a really cool, fun plane to learn. It has a lot of neat features and it has a lot of really cool use cases. Now today we're going to be flying a Hawaiian CRJ-700. Now, in real life, Hawaiian doesn't operate CRJ-700s. But we are on the island of Hawaii at Hilo International. We'll be taking it down to Honolulu in what is a very typical regional jet flight. Hawaiian Airlines operates this route, traditionally with a Boeing 717, which is very similar to our airplane. You got two jet engines in the back and kind of a similar sized cabin. So that's what we'll be doing. And we're going to hop into the cockpit, get all set up, and we'll talk a little bit more about what the CRJ is. All right, so welcome onto the flight deck of the CRJ-700. Now, we are loaded up with 51 passengers today and about 1,300 pounds of fuel, or 1,300 pounds of cargo and about 10,000 pounds of fuel, more than we're going to need for this particular flight. And we're on the ground here in Hilo. Now, I'm not going to run through the entire startup flow because there's other places you can find that if you're really interested in it. There's a lot of great tutorials on the CRJ, the Dudes tutorials, as well as Filbert Flies has a really good fly along with a real CRJ pilot. All those are really good resources. So for now, I've just gotten the cockpit set up the way I always do when I'm preparing a flight. We have the FMS set up here. I need to actually hit one button, copy the perf-init data in, and now we're all set up. So we're going to be going from Hilo to Honolulu, and we are getting ready to start. So this is the point when I'd usually get my IFR clearance and get on the road. But it is a fun airplane. It's a little bit different from all your other airliners, your A3. It's very different from the A320 because that's its own beast. But it's just a very interesting airplane to fly, and it's a little different from both Boeing and Airbuses. Now, a big part of flying airliners in general is attention to detail and understanding the routes that you're going to fly and why you fly them. So we're going to talk through a little bit of that today and the impacts that has on our flight. We are here at Hilo. We're going to be taking the Paris 4 departure, or SID, and where that'll take us out to the sea, off to the east, and then we'll turn north for Honolulu. I use ChartFox for all my charts. You can access that with your VATSIM ID, and that's really good for all the U.S. charts. So if you're looking for that, that's a great source, and you're on the VATSIM network. We are not flying on VATSIM today because I can't talk to people and ATC at the same time. So we are all set up. We are going to go ahead and make sure that we are taken away from the jetway. Our doors are closed and locked.
Captain,
pull the wheel chocks.
all passengers are aboard.
And get ready to start. So beacon's going on. We will make sure that our hydraulics are to auto. We will turn our left and right fuel boost on. And we'll make sure the AC is set up too. That's fine. Now I'm using pushback helper for this. For pushing back and controlling the tug. There are a lot of add-ons too. I'm not up to date on the latest and greatest. But I use pushback helper. Probably a couple versions old at this point. As we depart beautiful Hawaii. Now, a little bit about the CRJ while we're getting all set up. Stands for Canadair Regional Jet. It's based on a Bombardier Challenger 600, which in turn is based on a concept developed by Bill Lear of Learjet fame in the 1970s. He came up with the idea for a twin-engine, supercritical wing airplane. So we're going to release the parking brake, and we'll just push back into the left, I think. Or back into the other left. Well, we start the engines. Hit the button. Engine starts really simple. You hit the button and then uncage the throttle when you're ready to go. So, based on a private jet, the Challenger 600, Bombardier repeatedly came back to the idea of stretching it throughout the 80s and into the 90s. But it gained traction finally in the early 1990s, in the late 80s, early 90s. The CRJ-100 and 200, 100 first, had its first flight in 1991. Now, these were smaller, around 40 to 50 passengers, and underpowered by most pilot accounts. So a lot of regional airline pilots will talk about the crappy regional jet. A lot of them are talking about flying the CRJ-200. But these are sold, they sell well. Bombardier eventually goes out and says in 1997, or in the later 90s, leading up to 1997, they want to stretch it more. They tune up the engine, give it a little bit more power, and adds a few neat features, leading edge slats, high lift slats. They uprate the engine, which is a GE CF34-8C5 for you jet engine fans. And that becomes the airplane we're in now, the CRJ-700, which is a larger regional jet that can carry up to 70 passengers. Notably, we talked about from the original concept, a supercritical wing. That'll have some impacts when you're getting up to high altitude, and you'll just have to keep an eye on it. You can get behind the power curve pretty easily. 2 rear-mounted turbofan engines, and a T-tail in the back. The basic design and the basic fuselage are the same as the CRJ-100, just made larger. But I have seen sources that say that there's only about 15% of the components in the CRJ-700 are unmodified straight from the CRJ-200. So there's quite a lot of design and development that happened while they were developing the CRJ-700. But it's still it's the same type rating. So pilots who are qualified for the CRJ-100 and 200 qualified to fly the CRJ-700, which is important for airlines. It's used pretty extensively by regional airlines, especially in the United States. Europe as well, and some in Japan, but a lot of the CRJs flying are in the U.S. It's a very common sight, especially on the east coast of the U.S. I gotta start my left engine, don't I? You can taxi on one engine, but there's no traffic here, so there's not really any reason to. So we're going to be departing on runway 26 here. We're going to take the Paris 4, which really what we're going to do is fly runway heading and then turn right to a heading of 045 to intercept our track out to SAPD. And then we will go from there out to Honolulu. All right, so we're lined up on the runway here, ready to rock. Now, you will notice we have a couple of hills out in front of us. One would be the volcano of Mauna Kea, and the other would be Mauna Loa off to our left. Mauna Kea is off to our right. That's the one we're in danger of hitting if we just take off straight out. So we're going to be following the departure and going 0 to 045 on departure. So instead of, usually I'd dial in runway heading, but for now we're going to go ahead and dial in 045, and I'll hand fly it off of the approach, or I'll hand fly it out off of the runway, and then we'll worry about the autopilot getting dialed in after that. So we are set up. I'm just going to run before takeoff checklist real quick. Thrust reversers are armed. Transponder is not required, but we'll turn it on anyway. Spoilers are retracted. Brake temperatures are green. Cabin crew has been notified. We briefed the departure. We have takeoff clearance because I'm clearing us. Landing lights, strobes, we are all lit up. All right, so we're ready to go. Last thing to do is hit the toga button. You can hit the screw here, or you can actually look down and hit the button on the throttle. We're going to rotate at 131 knots. That's going to be VR here, and the tablet here will calculate that for you, and then you just have to press set all to get those speeds in there, and then we'll climb out like that. So brakes are off, throttle's coming up. We're going to go toga power. Just taking a little bit of left rudder to stay on the center line. That's V1. We're going to rotate. We should fly off pretty well. And we do. Gear up, flaps up. And we're going to aim. We're going to come back to climb and aim for about 200 knots.
Too low. Terrain.
All right, so now we're going to begin our right-hand turn to 045.
Terrain.
And then we will get on our way. At this point, we can start dialing in speeds. We'll say 220 knots for now. Make sure we're in the climb detent. We will get heading set up. Now we're going to climb up. We'll just dial in our cruising altitude of 24,000, flight level 240. ATC might give you something else, but we're ATC for today, and that's what we're going to do. And there it is. Heading 045, we're good to put on the autopilot. So that's a takeoff in the CRJ. Nothing too crazy, but you do get to punch in some numbers, like you get to set the trim. We were set at 7.1 today. You get to look up the values, and I always love punching in numbers. So that's a lot of fun. Now, after takeoff, gear is up, flaps are retracted, reversers are disarmed, spoilers are in. We're going to turn off the cross-flow override. We're good on our barometric pressure for now. Anti-ice, we're not going to need it. And once we get above 10,000 feet, we'll take seatbelt signs off probably. So as I was saying before, the CRJ is one of the most widely used regional jets, and that's a really fun place to fly if you're a simmer. Now, that's because these regional jet routes are usually 1 to 2 hours, and they can be between major cities, especially in the U.S. You might be on a CRJ if it's not necessarily an airlines hub. So if you're flying Delta somewhere not Atlanta, even if it's relatively populous, you might be on a CRJ or something like that. Delta, I think, is mostly over to CRJ-900s by now. And of course, we talk about being on a Delta CRJ, but you're really on a regional airline carrier's CRJ, like SkyWest is one that works pretty closely with, I believe, United and American, but I'm not sure about that. There's a bunch of different regional airlines that fly these planes for the major airlines, although some are owned by them too. It's a little complicated, but you'll see these guys with different call signs if you watch or listen to ATC for whatever reason. But they connect a lot of really cool routes, and you can really fly. In the U.S., you really can fly pretty realistically anywhere. I mean, between Washington and some of the New York airports, between Florida places and Texas, and pretty much anywhere in the U.S., you'll find regional jets like this or like an Embraer E-Jet. All right, so we're going to up our climb speed just because we're getting a little bit behind where I'd like to be. Once we get above, we'd like to climb at 250 knots until we get to 10,000 feet ideally, and then crank it up to 275. Will probably take us the rest of the way. But as we were saying, very common in the U.S., and these flights are under 2 hours for the most part. So, somewhere as short as this one, this is about a 40-minute flight, and that's perfectly realistic. And that's a great sweet spot for flight simmers, because sometimes that's all I have is an hour or two to sit down and fly a quick route in the CRJ. Plus, you add setup time, and it probably adds another 30 minutes to an hour. So it's a good length for your actual playing experience, as opposed to long-haul routes where it's a little bit tougher to carve out that kind of time in a busy life. All right, so we've made our first turn onto our first airway. We're heading up to Honolulu now. We can see the mountains off to our left and the island of Hawaii. I don't know if it's named for the state or the state's named for it or the island chain. Not the point here today. Now, this is a really fun, deep airplane, and I think a lot of people would lead this off by saying this is the deepest airplane we have in the sim right now. And it is, especially if you're looking for an airliner. But I think it also holds up well and will hold up well into the future. So I don't want to make it sound like it's the only game in town right now, so we're stuck with it. It's a genuinely good airplane, and it's a lot of fun, and it's a little bit more manual than some of the others, especially the A320. But it has a lot of really cool features and a really cool use case. The first thing I should probably address, though, is why you would bother flying an airliner at all. It is a specific thing in flight simulation, airliners. And especially when I talk to combat flight sim players, I like DCS as much as the next guy. The big question is, why would you want to sit on an airliner on autopilot for 2 hours? And that's a fair question. You're not going there, you're not dropping any bombs, you're not doing anything really exciting in the center, you're not even bush flying where you're landing in weird spots and trying to pick out landing sites and do those kinds of challenges. It's a very different kind of challenge. It's a very procedure-oriented challenge. It's a very detail-oriented challenge. It's just a different experience. And it's not a bad experience, but it's definitely a different pace than something like Combat Flight Simulator, or most forms of entertainment, frankly. There's busy times and not busy times in the cockpit when you're flying these airplanes. Now, regional airliners like the CRJ-700 don't have this issue so much because you're not going to be spending tons of time in the cruise. I think we'll be cruising for like 15 minutes. But on long-haul flights, you have to kind of entertain yourself some other ways too. There's lots of stuff you can do in the airplane. And again, like I said, this is a very detail-oriented thing, and it's I liken it to being like a baseball game a little bit. It's a little bit slower paced than maybe a football game. Sorry, anyone who's not American in the viewers, but it's a little bit more slow paced. It's a little more relaxing when it's slow, and then when it gets exciting, and there's a lot of work to do. It's also very detail-oriented. You have to understand your airplane. You have to understand how it works. You have to understand what you need to do, when you need to do it, and how all the systems you're interacting with work. So in that respect, it's very similar to something like DCS. Adding human air traffic control on top of that is another very interesting layer, which adds a lot of depth to the experience as well. Because at that point, you're constantly communicating with other people. You're constantly monitoring the airplane. Just because you're on autopilot doesn't mean you're not flying. This airplane doesn't have an auto throttle, so we still have to control the throttle, so you can't just step away completely. But even when you have an auto throttle, there's plenty to do during a flight. You can check your fuel. You can check the route. You can look up the weather at your destination. If you want to, you can watch Netflix or YouTube or whatever else. I like to catch up on channel comments when I'm in the cruise. That's a nice thing I can do if I have some downtime. It's just a different experience. But it can be very exciting, and the cockpit can get very busy. The pilot workload can get very busy, especially when you're in a busy approach, when you have human ATC. It is very exciting in spots, but it's a different experience than that. But it's very worthwhile, I think, and very fun. And again, the CRJ 2-hour flights, real sweet spot. Now, this is a pilot's airplane. You're going to be inputting a lot of values. You need to know. You need to be able to set the trim and set all your weight and understand that. You also have. It's just a slightly different interface than a lot of other airplanes. You have your primary flight displays up here, and then you have some standby gauges over here. These are your engine parameters, and then you have your status page. But you can flip through all these just like you would on another airliner, and it shows you a lot of interesting information. But it is very manual because you're using because you're managing the throttle manually. There's no auto throttle. Like the CJ4, you are going to be managing your speed and just have to keep an eye on that. I think the biggest hurdle with this airplane is speed. That's the biggest way I get into trouble with it. I also just like the look, the rounded CRT screens. It's a little bit unique. There's more practical designs. The A320 has a more practical avionics setup, but I like it. It's fun. It's a little bit different, and I think it's modeled really nicely. So what do you need to know to fly this airplane? The big thing, again, is speed. Keeping the speed where it needs to go. You have to keep a very fine eye on it sometimes. There's not necessarily a power setting that'll keep you going the same speed all the time in cruise. But you just have to keep an eye on it while you're cruising. And even more while you're on approach, it's easy to get too slow, especially fully configured. And you might not be able to power your way out of an issue if you get too slow. So that's something to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind, understanding how to use the tablet and when you need to plug all these things in. I would get a checklist for an airplane like this. You almost need it. This is definitely I'm not going to use those words, but it's a deep airplane. So you will be learning this airplane. You'll be learning how to operate it. You're going to have to invest some time, and I think a checklist is really really essential for this kind of airplane. I have one that I use. I will link the one that I used. It's just off flightsim.to. I took that and updated it with a couple of tweaks for me personally, and you can do the same thing. Definitely worthwhile to use a checklist, find a checklist you like, use it, practice with it. And if you need to make changes, if you just have slightly different flows, different ways you like to do it, you can update the checklist or, adjust your process as needed. But definitely get a checklist because this is a deep airplane. You're going to be learning the systems. You're going to be learning how to program the FMS. And it's not that different from A320 in that respect in the broad strokes. But it is something, if you're brand new to airliners, you'll have to sit down and get to grips with. As far as planes like it, again, in the sim, we don't have a ton right now like it. I mean, the CJ-4 is, like we talked about in the CJ-4 video, probably the most similar, just because it's a twin-engine jet. If you have the Deluxe or whatever it's called version, you also have the Citation Longitude, which is a larger Cessna jet, which is going to be even more similar to this. Other than that, there isn't a whole heck of a lot, at least in the regional jet space. We start talking about A320s. The fly-by-wire A32NX is another really great airliner if you want to get into flying airliners in Microsoft Flight Simulator. There's also a couple other mods for the Boeings, the Boeing 747 and 787 if you have that airplane. But the A32NX is the gold standard for that kind of thing, certainly. As we approach, we're getting close to top of descent. We're going to use our speed climb mode. So we're going to set the speed of like 270 knots probably. And we will descend down to 4,000 feet as it calls out in the charts. Now, upcoming, there are a few airplanes too that are going to be released shortly as of October of 2021. We're expecting the PMDG 737, which will be, again, closer in roll to a A320, but still a high-fidelity jet. And we also have the Phoenix A320, which is going to be another high-fidelity jet that you can use. Especially, both of those jet, A320 and 737s, are also used for relatively short hops. So you can still fly a lot of the same routes with those airplanes. So we have begun our descent. We are going to come off the throttle. I like to use speed climb mode just because it will control the speed and won't let me get too slow or too fast. You can also use the vertical speed mode, but I try to use the speed mode whenever I can. And if we look in here, we'll see that we don't really have any restrictions. If we go to the legs, we see behind the right slash is going to be our restriction, so we need to be above 4,000 feet at Dilley and at 4,000 feet for Chalet, 210 knots. So we will come off the power. I'll probably bring the speed back a little bit. I've never flown into here, so I don't know how it's going to go. We're probably a little high and a little fast. I use the speed brake pretty liberally, especially when you're trying to descend like this. It's a major help. One other thing you might consider if you're interested in flying these airplanes, I haven't, but there are a few different passenger simulation tools. I think self-loading cargo, PAX, and Luke Air Tool. Luke Air Tool being the free passenger simulation. Those are all good if you want a little bit more structure. You want to be able to load passengers, do announcements, have satisfaction ratings. Those kinds of add-ons are really good too if you're looking for something a little bit extra challenge with your flying your airliner. All right, so we're getting towards Chalet now. We're going to run our descent checklist, kind of. And we're going to turn our landing lights on. We're going to make sure our nav aids are set. We're just going to tune in the ILS. So that's going to be 110.5 at Honolulu. It should do it automatically. But you never know. It's good to have. We are all set there. We will be going to the barometric pressure, 3003. And we will be in auto there. Okay. Now, our approach, we're going to be doing the ILS in runway 04. Once we come off Chalet, it's going to be basically in front of us. If we zoom out a little bit on the PFD, you can kind of see where we're going to have to go. We're going to have to go off to the left and then to the right to get to... I can't see what... Yepgu. We're down at 220 knots, 9,000 feet. So we'll give a little bit more speed brake. And come down all the way to 210. Now at this point, ATC would probably be giving us instructions, or they would be ready to give us instructions. But because we're not on VATSIM or anything like that, we'll do it ourselves. We'll also get heading mode ready to go. I'll just tune up a right-hand or a left-hand turn. Okay, so we're hitting Chalet, and we're capturing the altitude at 4,000 feet now. We're going to have to take back control of the power, and we'll keep it at 210 knots. And we're going to go over to heading mode, which should allow us to take a left-hand turn to about heading 255. And at high speeds, the throttle management isn't so tricky. I find it's trickier at the lower speeds, trying to maintain a slow speed, particularly in airspace. So we're going to vector ourselves to Vepgu here. We'll be flying out that way to the sea and then making a right-hand turn to come on into Honolulu. Now I did look at the chart. We're coming into one of the shorter runways. It's 9,000 feet, still plenty of runway. But I'm not sure how, if they, this is what SimBrief gave me. So I'm not sure if they actually use that in real life. Alright, so we're about far enough out. I'm going to go ahead and go direct to Yepgu. So we're going to hit Yepgu here in our direct page. Exec that, and then remember to go over to nav. Then we'll be making somewhat of a tight turn into the ILS for runway 4 right. Looking at the chart, at Yepgu, we need to be at or above 3,000, then we'll be on the glide slope and descending. So we will go ahead and descend to 3,000 feet as well. Getting a little fast. 210 knots. .3,000 feet. The airport's going to be off to our right, just about off our nose. On the shores of Oahu. Give it a little bit of speed brake just to help it get down. And now I'm really just gauging by the purple line when we're going to hit the bottom of our descent, when we're going to hit 3,000 feet. And adjusting my throttle to adjust that. So to descend more slowly, we add power. To descend less slowly, we take away power. And you'll see it's tuned the localizer here. We'll probably still go over to nav mode just in case. But it should do everything automatically once we go into approach. Alright, we're coming up on Yepgoop. And then once we make the turn, we'll go into approach mode and the airplane should help start descending on its own. Even though we've got a little too much power to get all the way to 3,000. Now we're going to be shooting on approach. We'll be going to flaps 8. That's 2 ticks of flaps below 200 knots. And then once we're indicating below 180, we can go flaps 20, and if we get any slower, that'll be it. Speed below 180 knots for gear down, and then about 2,000 feet we'll be looking for gear down. And there's 3,000 feet. And we're beginning our turn to final. I am going to hit approach mode. It's tuning Loc 1. But we can go ahead and make the nav source Loc 1 anyway. And dial in heading just in case. And you'll see we have a green diamond here. That's going to be our glide slope. And so the aircraft should follow it. What it's saying now is that we're a little bit below the glide slope. And we have the runway off our nose. We're going to the right runway. Let's just verify that. Yep, we're going to be going to the runway on the right. So there's 2. The left runway is shorter by about 2,000 feet. We could probably make the left runway too, but right runway will be more than enough for us. And we're below 280, so let's go to flaps 8. That will upset it a little bit. And I'm just going to zero out the altitude too, just so we don't get too confused. And by we, I mean the computer. And it's blinking glide slope. We've captured the glide slope. It should start descending to follow the green diamond. And all I'm doing is managing the throttle to keep it right now at about 180. We are now on a 10-mile final for runway 4 right into Honolulu. And it doesn't take much power. You can see where we're at in power setting right now. It's not taking much. And it's always good to double check after you've been coming, especially steep downhill, that speed brakes are in. That's an easy mistake to make. So we're going to follow the glide slope down to whenever we feel comfortable taking over, we'll hit the autopilot disconnect. And then we will flare gently once we're hitting 50 to 30 feet. We will also, once we hit the ground and we get our we'll slowly bring the nose wheel down. And then I will hit the reverse button. And that will let us use reverse thrust. So our thrust reversers are armed. We are ready to go. So once we hit the ground with all 3 wheels, we will use reverse thrust, and that should stop us pretty simply. We will be exiting to our left is going to be the main terminal. That's 2,000 feet, 6-mile final. I'm going to go ahead and bring the gear down And we can go flaps 20. And I say flaps, but the slats, what we talked about earlier, as one of the key innovations of this airplane, those also go out too. So we're coming down, and then the last gate is going to be 160 knots. Once we're below 160 knots, we can go to full flaps, which is another 2 knocks. And then we're shooting for about 140. This is my rule of thumb. If we get a little below that, that's not the worst thing in the world, but it is a nice approach. And we're getting a little slow here, so I'm going to give it some power, and I'm going to take control too. You can see the green dot's we're getting a little below the glide slope here, and that'll be the first thing that kind of goes wrong if you take the power out too soon. We're still looking just fine though. 200. It's much less dramatic than a DC-6 approach. We're getting a bit low and a bit slow.
50, 40, 30, 20, 10.
Alright, so a little hard, but that'll happen. It is compared to other airliners, it's very low to the ground. So that is the thing that'll get you, especially if you flip between different airplanes. If you've been flying something, even like a DC-6 or A320, you're much lower to the ground. And your landing gear isn't that long, and you're going to touch down when you're much lower. That is the one tricky thing on landing, is being able to judge that. But not too bad. We made it down, and we had plenty of runway. Right, that was a really fun little flight. I really recommend that route. I was looking for something different than the Eastern U.S., and that's a bit of a hidden gem. We're going to taxi on to parking, and we'll wrap it up. We are here. Welcome to Honolulu, Hawaii, everybody. Now, this is a really fun route, and there's a lot of routes like it that you can fly in a similar amount of time. There's about 45 minutes, so probably an hour and 15 minutes start to finish. But there's a lot of routes like this that you can fly with interesting approaches. You can go into smaller airports, large airports, whatever you want. So that's really fun, and it's just a really fun, versatile plane, especially if you're interested in learning an airliner and Microsoft Flight Simulator. I think it's a really good place to go if you're looking for a detailed airplane to learn. And that's a big thing about this airplane, is it's going to be a learning airplane. You're not probably going to hop in and fly it perfectly, and that's okay. Definitely, if you're at all interested in flying airliners and Flight Simulator, this is a really good option. You can also absolutely try the A320X, because that's completely free. This is a payware add-on. So that's something to consider. So that's it for today, everybody. If you have any questions, comments, any fun CRJ stories from yourself, drop them down in the comment section below. Otherwise, like, comment, subscribe, the usual YouTube nonsense. And I will talk to you all next time. Have a good one. See ya.